There is a human experience that is deeply common, yet rarely named with honesty. It does not appear as an obvious crisis, nor as explicit suffering. It emerges quietly, almost unnoticed, as a subtle sense of inner displacement. Externally, life keeps functioning. Responsibilities are still being fulfilled. Social interactions continue. But internally, something no longer fits. The world begins to feel excessively loud. Conversations repeat themselves. Exchanges lose depth. And what once felt sufficient now creates a fatigue that is difficult to explain. This is not clinical sadness. It is not depression. It is something more subtle, more refined. It is the discomfort that arises when consciousness matures before the surrounding environment does. At this stage, a quiet realization begins to form. You may still belong to the familiar places, but those places no longer belong to you. This state is often interpreted as isolation, as emotional coldness, or as difficulty adapting. But this interpretation is superficial, because in most cases, this is not rejection of the world, but a silent inner transformation that has not yet found language. The truth is, not every withdrawal comes from emotional dysfunction. Some withdrawals are the result of a necessary inner realignment. The problem is that almost no one speaks about this, because this experience challenges a deeply normalized belief that belonging is more important than inner coherence. Recognizing this truth is not an act of superiority. It is an act of honesty, and for many, it is the first step of a transformation that is not visible, but irreversible. If you have felt this silent inner displacement, perhaps it is not a mistake. Perhaps it is the beginning of something not yet fully understood, but profoundly legitimate.
When this inner shift begins, it is rarely recognized for what it is. Most people do not say, "Something in me is reorganizing." They say, "There must be something wrong with me." Because what follows does not feel empowering at first. It feels confusing, disorienting, and often lonely. You may notice that environments you once tolerated now feel exhausting. That conversations you once participated in naturally now require effort. That social interactions leave you feeling depleted rather than nourished. And because nothing is visibly wrong, the mind begins to search for explanations. Am I becoming antisocial? Am I emotionally blocked? Am I failing to adapt? These questions are not pathological. They are attempts to restore coherence in a system that has quietly changed. The pain here is subtle, but persistent. It is the pain of realizing that you no longer fit into roles that once defined you. You may still show up, still participate, still smile. But internally, something resists. Not out of rebellion, not out of arrogance, but out of fatigue. A fatigue that comes from constantly translating yourself into versions that feel acceptable. This is where judgment often enters. You begin to criticize your own withdrawal, to label it as weakness, to compare yourself to people who seem socially effortless. But comparison here is misleading, because what you are experiencing is not social failure. It is an internal misalignment between who you are becoming and the structures you are still trying to inhabit. Naming this pain without judgment means allowing yourself to see it clearly, not as a flaw, not as emotional damage, but as information. Information that tells you that something essential can no longer be ignored. This pain does not demand immediate action. It demands recognition. It asks you to stop forcing adaptation where adaptation now requires self-betrayal. When you stop judging this experience, something important happens. The anxiety softens, the self-criticism loosens, and in that space, clarity begins to emerge. You realize that you are not withdrawing from life. You are withdrawing from what no longer reflects you. This distinction matters, because the pain you feel is not asking to be eliminated. It is asking to be understood, and understanding, not correction, is what allows this process to move forward without turning into unnecessary suffering.
Once the pain is named, without judgment, something begins to shift. Not because the discomfort disappears, but because its meaning changes. What you once experienced as a personal flaw can now be seen as a sign of internal development. The loss of interest in constant social engagement is not emotional withdrawal. It is discernment. The preference for fewer conversations is not rejection of others. It is a response to a growing need for depth. When consciousness matures, it becomes less tolerant of superficial exchange. This does not make you better than others. It simply means you are no longer satisfied with what once sustained you. Just as the body changes its nutritional needs over time, the psyche changes what it requires to remain healthy. At this stage, noise becomes draining, excess becomes exhausting, and stimulation without meaning feels invasive. Silence, on the other hand, begins to feel restorative. This is not escape. It is regulation. The pain you felt was not caused by being alone. It was caused by remaining too long in environments that no longer aligned with who you are becoming. Seen this way, the discomfort is no longer meaningless. It becomes a signal that your inner structure is reorganizing itself, that your tolerance for inauthenticity has decreased, that your nervous system is seeking coherence, not stimulation. Reframing the pain does not mean denying difficulty. It means recognizing that not all discomfort exists to be removed. Some discomfort exists to guide. What once felt like isolation can now be understood as a transition, a movement away from dispersion and toward integration. This is why forcing yourself to remain socially available at all costs only intensifies the pain, because the psyche is no longer asking for connection in quantity. It is asking for alignment. And alignment, while quieter, is far more sustaining. When you understand this, the narrative changes. You are no longer pulling away. You are consolidating. And what felt like loss
begins to reveal itself as a necessary refinement, not a rejection of life, but a preparation for living more fully from the inside out.
This inner transition is not a modern phenomenon. Long before it was discussed in self-help language or reframed as lifestyle preference, it was studied as a psychological necessity. Carl Gustav Jung, one of the founding figures of depth psychology, observed this pattern repeatedly in his clinical work. He noticed that individuals who began to develop a more stable inner center often experienced a reduction in social tolerance, not because they became antisocial, but because their psyche was reorganizing around something deeper than collective expectation. Jung called this process individuation. Individuation is not self-improvement. It is not optimization. And it is not withdrawal from the world. It is the gradual movement from a life structured primarily by adaptation toward a life organized around inner coherence. In this transition, the persona, the social mask, begins to lose its dominance. The persona does not disappear, but it is no longer allowed to define the center of identity. When this shift occurs, many relationships begin to feel hollow. Not because others are inadequate, but because the interaction no longer reaches the depth the psyche requires. Jung was explicit about this. He warned that individuation often brings with it a period of loneliness. Not pathological loneliness, but existential solitude. This solitude is not a symptom to be cured. It is a condition that allows the individual to separate from the collective psyche. Only through this separation can a person begin to distinguish what belongs to them from what was inherited, imposed, or unconsciously absorbed. Jung observed that those who resisted this phase by clinging to constant social validation often developed anxiety, depression, or chronic inner tension. Because the psyche, once it has outgrown a structure, cannot return to it without cost. This is why forcing extroversion, forcing availability, or forcing connection can feel so draining during this phase. The inner system is no longer aligned with external demand. Jung did not romanticize this process. He acknowledged its difficulty, its confusion, its emotional cost. But he also understood that without this stage, psychological maturity remains incomplete. In his view, the individual who never risks solitude never truly becomes an individual. What you are experiencing, then, is not deviation. It is participation in a universal psychological pattern, one that has been observed, named, and studied for over a century. And this understanding does something essential. It removes the fear that something has gone wrong. It places your experience within a larger map. A map that does not promise comfort, but offers orientation. And orientation is what allows the psyche to move forward without collapsing into self-blame. This is not the end of connection. It is the reorganization of how connection will exist from this point on. And from here, the question is no longer, why am I becoming more alone? The question becomes, what is this solitude preparing me to encounter within myself.
At this point, something subtle happens. Once you understand that your withdrawal is not a flaw, but a signal, the mind begins to ask a deeper question. If this process is real and necessary, why do so many people spend their entire lives running from it? Jung had an answer. He observed that the majority of people do not fail because they are incapable. They fail because they avoid the inner confrontation that individuation demands. At the center of this avoidance is what Jung called the shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is not darkness in a moral sense. It is everything that was excluded from conscious identity in order to be accepted, praised, or left unharmed. Traits, impulses, needs, anger, sensitivity, ambition, vulnerability, all pushed aside to maintain belonging. Most people organize their lives to avoid ever meeting this part of themselves. They stay busy. They stay connected. They stay distracted. They stay agreeable. Not because it fulfills them, but because it protects them from internal tension. But when individuation begins, this strategy stops working. The psyche withdraws energy from external performance and redirects it inward. And this is where the experience becomes rare, because very few people are willing to stay present when the inner noise gets louder. Very few people resist the urge to numb, to fill, to escape. You did not escape. You noticed the discomfort. You stayed with it, even when it felt isolating. That alone places you outside the psychological average. This does not make you better. It makes you rarer. Rarity in this context is not about talent, intelligence, or moral superiority. It is about tolerance for inner complexity. The capacity to remain conscious while parts of the self that were once hidden begin to surface. Jung warned that those who refuse this encounter pay a quiet price. Their lives remain functional but internally fragmented. They become dependent on approval, roles, and external rhythm to feel real. You are stepping into a different pattern. One where identity is no longer borrowed from the outside. This is why your circle may be shrinking, why certain conversations feel empty, why superficial reassurance no longer works. The psyche is reorganizing around truth instead of comfort. And that process requires a level of psychological honesty that most people never practice. This is not a phase you force. It is a threshold you cross. And once crossed, there is no clean return to unconscious belonging. You can still relate. You can still connect. But you cannot pretend without cost. This is the price of becoming real. And it is also the foundation of a more integrated self. In the next stage, this confrontation deepens. Because meeting the shadow is not the end. It is the doorway to something far more stabilizing. A center that does not depend on external permission. And that is where true psychological grounding begins. When Jung spoke about the danger of encountering the shadow, he was precise. The danger was not what you might find. It was what happens if the encounter has no center. Without an internal anchor, the psyche can fragment. One part observes, another reacts, another resists, and another seeks escape. This is why Jung never separated shadow work from the emergence of the self. The self, in Jungian psychology, is not the ego. It is not personality. It is not identity as society defines it. The self is the organizing center of the whole psyche. It does not shout. It does not demand. It does not persuade. It stabilizes.
When the self begins to emerge, something subtle shifts. Inner tension no longer feels chaotic. It becomes directional. Conflicting impulses do not disappear. They begin to relate to something larger than the ego. This is the phase where many people mistakenly believe they are regressing. Old memories resurface. Unresolved emotions return. Patterns once suppressed ask to be integrated. But this is not collapse. It is reorganization. The psyche is no longer structured around adaptation. It is reorganizing around coherence. Jung described this as the movement from a life lived outwardly to a life lived inwardly. Not withdrawn, not isolated, but internally referenced. At this stage, external validation loses its regulating power. Praise feels pleasant but unnecessary. Criticism feels informative but no longer destabilizing. Decisions begin to arise from alignment rather than fear. This is why your pace may have slowed, why urgency no longer drives you, why forcing outcomes feels increasingly foreign. The self operates on depth, not speed, and depth cannot be rushed without distortion. Jung warned that modern culture rarely tolerates this phase. It demands visibility. It rewards noise. It confuses movement with meaning. But individuation is not a performance. It is an internal recentering. This is why your solitude now feels different than loneliness. Loneliness seeks replacement. Solitude creates coherence. You are no longer alone with yourself. You are becoming yourself. The internal dialogue slows. Reactivity softens. Intuition sharpens. Not dramatically, reliably. This is the quiet strength Jung trusted more than any technique. Because once the self becomes the reference point, the psyche no longer needs constant external correction. it self-regulates. In the next stage, this internal center is recognized not just as stability, but as meaning. And that recognition changes how you see yourself permanently. That is where the process reaches its crown.
At this stage, there is no revelation, no sudden clarity, no dramatic breakthrough. There is recognition. Recognition of something that has been forming quietly over time. Jung understood that individuation does not arrive as an event. It arrives as a shift in reference. You no longer ask who you should be to belong. You ask whether a situation is aligned with who you are. This is the coronation. Not a ceremony, not a title, but a quiet internal authority. You do not announce it. You do not defend it. You do not explain it. It expresses itself in restraint, in discernment, in the ability to walk away without resentment. The world may not notice, and that is precisely the point. Jung warned that true individuation often appears ordinary from the outside because it does not seek recognition, it seeks coherence. This is why your values now feel non-negotiable, not rigid, not dogmatic, but rooted. You can adapt without betraying yourself. You can engage without dissolving. You can be present without performing. This is the difference between confidence and integration.
Confidence seeks reinforcement. Integration requires none. You are no longer defined by reaction, nor by opposition, nor by withdrawal. You choose from alignment, and that choice is quiet. Jung believed that this stage marks the transition from psychological survival to psychological maturity. Not happiness, not permanence, but grounded presence. You may still doubt. You may still struggle. You may still feel uncertain at times. But the center no longer collapses. This is not because life becomes easier. It is because you become more whole. The crown is not something placed upon you. It is something you realize you have been carrying from within. And once recognized, it does not demand your attention. It simply holds. In the final moments, there is no instruction, only orientation. And that orientation now belongs to you. If this reflection felt familiar, it is not because it was designed to persuade. It is because it described a process you are already living. Nothing here needs agreement. Nothing needs belief. Only recognition. If you choose to remain here, it is not to follow. It is to continue an exploration that is already underway. Liking this video does not signal approval. It allows this material to reach others who are navigating a similar inner terrain. Subscribing is not a commitment, it is an alignment. A decision to stay connected to depth rather than noise. Sharing is not promotion, it is recognition. A quiet gesture that says, "This may speak to you too." There is no community to join here, no identity to adopt, only a space where complexity is not simplified, where silence is respected, and where psychological maturity is not rushed. If this resonates, you already know why.
and if it does not, nothing is lost. The work continues either way, because individuation does not require an audience, it only requires attention. Thank you for staying until the end.